My name is Jonathan Blake, and I learned something about evil on the day I buried my son. Not the kind of evil you read about in newspapers or see on television, not the dramatic evil of movies and novels, but the quiet, patient evil that wears a familiar face and speaks in a voice you once trusted. The evil that waits 32 years to reveal itself, timing its appearance with surgical precision to inflict maximum damage. Alexander Blake died on a Thursday morning in September, when the autumn leaves were just beginning to turn and the air carried that crisp promise of winter. He was 35 years old, a successful architect who had designed buildings that would outlive him by centuries. The cancer took him quickly, which the doctors said was a mercy. 6 months from diagnosis to death, barely enough time to say goodbye. I was holding his hand when he passed. His fingers were so thin by then, like bird bones wrapped in pale skin. His breathing had been labored for hours, each breath a struggle against the inevitable. But in those final moments, his grip on my hand tightened, and his eyes opened one last time. "Dad," he whispered, his voice barely audible above the steady beeping of the machines. "Thank you for everything, for being there, for never giving up on me." Those were his last words. "Thank you for being there." As if there had ever been any question, any doubt that I would be anywhere else. As if 35 years of unconditional love needed acknowledgement or gratitude. The funeral was held 3 days later at St. Matthew's Episcopal Church, the same church where I'd had him baptized as an infant. The sanctuary was packed with people whose lives Alexander had touched, colleagues from his architectural firm, clients whose dreams he'd helped build, friends from college and graduate school, neighbors who'd watched him grow up in our small Connecticut town. Sarah was there, of course, his fiancée, the woman he'd planned to marry in the spring. She sat in the front pew beside me, her hand resting on the engagement ring she still wore, tears streaming silently down her cheeks. They'd been together for 4 years, and she'd loved him with the kind of pure, uncomplicated devotion that reminded me of fairy tales. The service was beautiful. The rector spoke about Alexander's generosity, his talent, his unwavering commitment to creating spaces where people could live and work and find joy. His business partner, David Martinez, gave a eulogy that had half the congregation weeping openly. He talked about Alexander's vision, his integrity, his belief that architecture was about more than building structures. It was about building communities. I spoke last, though I'd wondered until the very moment I stood up whether I'd be able to get through it. I talked about the boy who'd built elaborate cities out of wooden blocks, who'd spent hours sketching buildings that existed only in his imagination, who'd announced at age 7 that he was going to design houses that made people happy. "Alexander believed that our surroundings shape our souls," I said, looking out at the sea of faces, all of them focused on me with the intensity of shared grief. He believed that beauty matters, that craftsmanship matters, that the spaces we inhabit can lift us up or tear us down. He spent his life creating beauty, leaving behind buildings that will inspire and comfort people for generations to come. I paused, my voice threatening to break. But the most beautiful thing Alexander ever built wasn't made of steel and glass and stone. It was the life he lived, the relationships he nurtured, the love he gave so freely to everyone around him. That's his true legacy. That's what will endure long after the buildings crumble and the blueprints fade. The burial was private, just family and close friends gathering around the simple granite headstone in Riverside Cemetery. The same cemetery where my own parents were buried, where Alexander's grandparents rested beneath weathered monuments to lives well lived. As the casket was lowered into the ground, I felt something inside me break that I knew would never heal. Sarah stayed close to me throughout that long day, her presence a comfort in the midst of overwhelming loss. She'd been like a daughter to me for 4 years, and Alexander's death had brought us together in our shared grief. We'd become allies in mourning, supporting each other through the practical necessities that follow death, the lawyers and insurance companies and endless paperwork that reduces a human life to signatures and claims forms. That evening, after the last mourner had left and the caterers had cleaned up the reception, Sarah and I sat in my living room, surrounded by flowers and sympathy cards and the overwhelming silence that follows a funeral. We didn't talk much. There wasn't much to say. We were both exhausted, emotionally drained, running on autopilot. "I should go," Sarah said finally, though she made no move to leave. "You need to rest." "Stay," I said. "Please, I don't want to be alone tonight." She nodded, understanding without explanation. She'd been spending most nights at my house since Alexander's death, neither of us wanting to face the emptiness alone. Her apartment felt too quiet, she'd told me, and my house felt too full of memories. Together we could at least share the burden of grief. We were sitting there in comfortable silence when we heard the car pull into the driveway. It was nearly 10 o'clock, too late for casual visitors, and I wasn't expecting anyone. Sarah and I exchanged glances, both of us thinking the same thing, probably a neighbor who'd missed the funeral coming to pay their respects. I went to the window and peered through the curtains. A black sedan sat in my driveway, expensive-looking, with New York plates. I didn't recognize it. The driver's side door opened and a woman stepped out. Tall, elegant, wearing a dark coat that probably cost more than most people's monthly salary. She moved with the confidence of someone accustomed to being noticed, to commanding attention. Even in the dim light from the street lamp, even after 32 years, I knew who she was. Victoria Pemberton. The woman who had given birth to Alexander and then vanished from our lives as completely as if she'd never existed at all. My hands began to shake. Sarah noticed immediately and moved to stand beside me at the window. "Who is it?" she asked. I couldn't answer, couldn't find the words to explain that the ghost of our past had chosen this moment, this terrible day, to materialize on my doorstep. I watched as Victoria smoothed her hair, checked her reflection in the car's window, and began walking toward my front door with the measured steps of someone who'd rehearsed this moment. The doorbell rang, two sharp chimes that seemed to echo through the house like gunshots. "Jonathan," Sarah said, concern clear in her voice, "you're pale as a sheet. Who is that?" "Alexander's mother," I managed to say. Sarah's intake of breath was sharp and sudden. She knew the story, of course. I'd told her early in her relationship with Alexander, wanting her to understand why certain topics were difficult for him, why he sometimes grew quiet when the subject of family came up. She knew that Victoria had left when Alexander was 3 years old, that she'd never contacted us again, that my son had grown up with a wound that never quite healed. The doorbell rang again, longer this time, more insistent. "What do you want to do?" Sarah asked. I stared at the door, my mind racing. Part of me wanted to ignore it, to pretend we weren't home, to let Victoria stand on my porch until she gave up and left. But another part of me, the part that had spent 32 years wondering what had happened to her, what had driven her away, needed to know why she was here now. "I have to answer it," I said. Sarah nodded, but her hand found mine and squeezed tight. "I'll be right here," she said. I walked to the front door on unsteady legs, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I took a deep breath, turned the lock, and opened the door. Victoria Pemberton stood on my porch like a vision from another lifetime. She was still beautiful, strikingly so, though the years had added silver to her dark hair and fine lines around her green eyes. She was impeccably dressed, everything about her radiating wealth and sophistication. But it was her expression that caught me off guard. Not grief, not regret, not the awkward uncertainty I might have expected from a woman confronting the father of the child she'd abandoned. She looked calculating, like someone sizing up an opponent. "Hello, Jonathan," she said, her voice carrying that same cultured accent I remembered, though it sounded more pronounced now, more deliberately refined. "I'm sorry for your loss." The words were appropriate, but they felt hollow, rehearsed. There was no emotion behind them, no genuine sympathy. Just the social nicety expected in such circumstances. "Victoria." I kept my voice neutral, though inside I was reeling. "This is unexpected." "I'm sure it is." She glanced past me into the house, her eyes taking in the flowers, the sympathy cards, the obvious aftermath of a funeral. "May I come in? I think we need to talk." Every instinct I had screamed at me to say no, to close the door and pretend this encounter had never happened. But I found myself stepping aside, allowing her into the home where her son had lived for the first 3 years of his life, the home she'd walked away from without a backward glance. Victoria entered my living room like she was conducting an inspection, her eyes cataloguing everything. The furniture, the artwork, the family photographs that chronicled Alexander's life from childhood to adulthood. She paused at the mantelpiece, studying a picture of Alexander at his college graduation, his cap askew and his grin wide with achievement. "He grew up handsome," she said, her tone conversational, as if she were commenting on the weather. "You did well with him." The casual dismissal of 32 years of single parenthood hit me like a physical blow. You did well with him, as if raising her son had been some kind of favor I'd done for her, rather than the greatest privilege of my life. "No thanks to you," I said, my voice harder than I'd intended. Victoria turned to face me, one eyebrow raised in mild surprise. "I suppose you're angry with me." "Angry?" I felt something hot and dangerous rising in my chest. Angry doesn't begin to cover it. "I understand your feelings, of course, but I hope we can be civilized about this. After all, we're both grieving." Grieving. The word hung in the air between us like an accusation. What right did she have to claim grief? What right did she have to mourn a son she'd never known? Sarah appeared in the doorway, and Victoria's attention shifted to her immediately. I saw calculation in those green eyes, assessment and evaluation, as if Sarah were a problem to be solved rather than a person to be acknowledged. "And you are?" Victoria asked. "Sarah Mitchell," Sarah replied, her voice steady despite the obvious tension in the room. "Alexander's fiancée." "Ah." Victoria's smile was sharp and predatory. "How lovely that he found someone. I'm Victoria Pemberton, Alexander's mother." The way she said it, mother, as if the title meant something coming from her, as if biological connection trumped actual relationship, made my blood pressure spike. Sarah's face went pale, but she held her ground. "I know who you are," Sarah said quietly. "Do you?" Victoria's tone suggested she doubted that very much. "Well then, you understand why I'm here." "Actually, I don't," I interjected. "Why are you here, Victoria? After 32 years of silence, after missing your son's entire life, why show up now? Why show up after he's dead?" Victoria moved to the couch and sat down without being invited, crossing her legs with practiced elegance. Everything about her posture suggested she was settling in for a long conversation, as if she belonged here, as if she had every right to make herself comfortable in my home. "I think you know why I'm here, Jonathan. We're not children anymore. We can speak plainly about these things." "These things? Alexander's estate, his assets, the fact that he died without a will, which means his property will be distributed according to state law. And state law, as I'm sure you're aware, favors blood relatives over other connections." The words hit me like ice water. I felt Sarah stiffen beside me, saw her face go from pale to ashen. Victoria was talking about money, about Alexander's inheritance, about turning my son's death into a financial opportunity. "Get out," I said, my voice low and dangerous. "Now, Jonathan, let's not be hasty. I know this is difficult, but we need to discuss practical matters. Alexander was quite successful, wasn't he? His architectural firm, his investments, the life insurance policy. I imagine it's a substantial estate. Get out of my house." Victoria's expression didn't change. She reached into her purse and pulled out a manila folder, which she placed on the coffee table between us. "I've had my lawyers look into this. Legally speaking, as Alexander's mother, I'm entitled to a significant portion of his estate, possibly all of it, depending on how the courts interpret the situation. You see, you never adopted him formally, did you? I never signed away my parental rights. In the eyes of the law, I'm still his next of kin." I stared at the folder, my mind reeling. It was true. I'd never seen the need for formal adoption. Alexander had been my son in every way that mattered. The legal paperwork had seemed irrelevant, unnecessary. Now I was beginning to understand what a mistake that had been. "This is insane," Sarah said, her voice shaking with anger. "You abandoned him. You disappeared from his life when he was 3 years old. You have no right to anything." Victoria turned to her with a smile that was all teeth and no warmth. "My dear, I'm afraid the law disagrees with you. Blood is blood regardless of circumstance, and I am Alexander's blood mother, whether I raised him or not." "You didn't just not raise him," I said, finding my voice at last. "You abandoned him. You left him crying for his mama, wondering what he'd done wrong, why you didn't love him enough to stay. Do you have any idea what that did to him? Do you have any idea how many years he spent in therapy trying to understand why his own mother had walked away?" For the first time, something flickered in Victoria's eyes. Not regret, exactly, but perhaps a momentary recognition of the pain she'd caused. But it was gone so quickly I might have imagined it. I was 19 years old, Jonathan. I was a child myself. I made the best decision I could under difficult circumstances. You made a selfish decision. You chose yourself over your son. I chose to give him a stable home with a father who could provide for him. You were established, successful, ready to be a parent. I wasn't. So you just left. In the middle of the night, without a word, without explanation. You let a 3-year-old think his mother had stopped loving him. Victoria's mask slipped for just a moment, and I saw something ugly underneath, something cold and calculating and utterly without empathy. What I did 32 years ago is irrelevant now. What matters is that Alexander is dead, and he died interstate, and I am his legal mother. The estate is substantial. I've done my research. 7 figures, possibly 8. That's a lot of money to just hand over to charity or distant connections. She looked pointedly at Sarah when she said, distant connections, and I felt rage building in my chest like steam in a pressure cooker. Sarah isn't a distant connection. She was going to be his wife. She loved him. Love doesn't have legal standing, I'm afraid. Marriage does, but they weren't married, were they? So really, when you strip away all the sentiment and emotion, I'm the only one with a legitimate claim to Alexander's inheritance. I stood up so quickly that Victoria actually flinched backward. For a moment her composed facade cracked, and I saw fear in her eyes. Good. She should be afraid. You want to talk about legal standing? Fine. Let's talk about abandonment laws. Let's talk about the fact that you haven't paid a dime of child support in 32 years. Let's talk about the fact that you forfeited any parental rights the moment you walked out that door and never looked back. The law is more complex than that, I'm afraid. My lawyers seem quite confident that I have a strong case. Then let them make it in court, because I will fight you every step of the way. I will spend every penny I have, mortgage this house, sell everything I own before I let you profit from my son's death. Victoria stood as well, smoothing her skirt with hands that trembled slightly. She was trying to maintain her composure, but cracks were showing in her perfect facade. I hoped we could handle this civilly, but if you insist on making this difficult— She picked up the folder from the coffee table. You'll be hearing from my attorneys. And Jonathan, you might want to prepare yourself for some uncomfortable revelations. There are things about Alexander's birth, about our relationship, that you might not want to become public. Sometimes it's better to settle these things quietly. The threat was clear, and it sent a chill down my spine. What revelations? What secrets was she hiding? But before I could ask, she was moving toward the door, her heels clicking sharply on the hardwood floor. "Victoria," I called after her. She paused, her hand on the doorknob. "Why now? If you'd wanted to be part of his life, you had 32 years to reach out. Why wait until he's dead to suddenly develop maternal feelings?" She turned back to me, and for just a moment, the mask slipped completely. What I saw underneath was chilling, pure calculated greed without even a pretense of sentiment. "Because now it's profitable," she said simply. Then she was gone, leaving Sarah and me alone with the echo of her words and the devastating realization that our grief was about to become someone else's opportunity. I sank back onto the couch, my legs suddenly unsteady. Sarah sat beside me, her face pale with shock. "She can't do this," Sarah said, but her voice lacked conviction. "She can't just show up after all these years and claim Alexander's estate." "She can try," I said, my voice hollow, "and she might succeed. I should have adopted him legally when he was young. I should have made sure there were no loopholes, no way for someone like her to—" I couldn't finish the sentence. Sarah took my hand in hers, her fingers cold but steady. "We'll fight her. Whatever it takes, we'll fight her." I looked at her, this young woman who'd loved my son, who was grieving his loss as deeply as I was, and felt a surge of protectiveness. Victoria had made this personal the moment she'd dismissed Sarah as a distant connection. She'd made it clear that she saw both of us as obstacles to be overcome, rather than people with legitimate claims to mourn Alexander's passing. "Yes," I said, my voice growing stronger. "We'll fight her. But first, I need to understand what we're up against. I need to know who Victoria Pemberton has become in the 32 years since she walked out of our lives." That night, after Sarah had finally gone home to her apartment, I sat at my computer and began researching. Victoria Pemberton, née Thompson, had not been difficult to track down. She'd left quite a trail over the past 3 decades, and none of it painted a flattering picture. After leaving us, she'd returned to her family's estate in the Hamptons. The Thompsons were old money, generational wealth built on shipping and real estate. Victoria had been the rebellious daughter who'd scandalized the family by running off with a middle-class architect and having a child out of wedlock. Her return had been conditional on her cutting all ties with her inappropriate past, meaning Alexander and me. She'd married well twice after that. First to Charles Pemberton, a venture capitalist 20 years her senior, who died in a sailing accident 5 years into their marriage, leaving her his substantial fortune. Then to Gregory Ashworth, a pharmaceutical executive who divorced her after 3 years, citing irreconcilable differences and paying a settlement that had set her up for life. Both marriages had produced stepchildren who'd been systematically alienated from their inheritance. Both had involved lengthy legal battles over estates and trust funds. Victoria, it seemed, had made a career out of marrying wealthy men, outlasting them or manipulating them, and walking away with as much of their money as possible. But the most damning thing I found was a series of articles from a Long Island newspaper about a charity scandal from 10 years earlier. Victoria had been on the board of a children's cancer research foundation. The irony wasn't lost on me, and had been accused of embezzling nearly $500,000 in donations. The charges had been dropped when the money was mysteriously returned, but the damage to her reputation had been significant. She was, in short, exactly what she appeared to be, a predator who specialized in exploiting family connections for financial gain. And now she'd set her sights on Alexander's estate. I called my lawyer first thing the next morning. Harold Zimmerman had been handling my legal affairs for 15 years, and he'd known Alexander since he was a teenager. He listened to my story with growing dismay, asking pointed questions about adoption papers and paternal rights and the complex web of laws that governed inheritance disputes. "I won't lie to you, Jonathan," he said when I'd finished. "She's right about the legal technicalities. Without formal adoption papers, without any legal documentation establishing your parental rights, the biological connection gives her a significant advantage. But she abandoned him. That has to count for something." It should, but abandonment laws are tricky, especially when the abandonment happened so long ago. And if she can prove she was young and financially unstable when she left, if she can paint it as a desperate mother doing what she thought was best for her child, Harold sighed. Juries can be sympathetic to that narrative. What about her history, the failed marriages, the charity scandal, the pattern of financial manipulation? That's more promising. If we can establish a pattern of behavior, show that she has a history of exploiting family connections for financial gain, it could significantly damage her credibility. But we'll need documentation, witnesses, concrete evidence. And even then, it's not a guarantee. What are our chances? Harold was quiet for a long moment. Honestly, maybe 50-50. It depends on the judge, the jury, how well her lawyers present her case. But there's something else you need to consider. What? The cost. A case like this could drag on for years. We're talking about hundreds of thousands of dollars in legal fees, possibly more. Even if we win, it could bankrupt you. I thought about that for a moment. The house where Alexander had grown up, the savings I'd accumulated over 35 years of work, the retirement fund I'd been building, all of it could disappear into legal fees. But the alternative was letting Victoria profit from my son's death, and that was unacceptable. "I don't care about the cost," I said. "She's not getting away with this." Harold made some notes on his legal pad. "All right, I'll start putting together a defense. But Jonathan, there's something else you should know. She mentioned uncomfortable revelations, secrets about Alexander's birth. Do you have any idea what she might be referring to?" I thought back to those early days, to the whirlwind romance that had resulted in Alexander's conception, to the complications of Victoria's pregnancy, and the months of uncertainty that had followed. There had been questions, doubts, moments when I'd wondered if there were things Victoria wasn't telling me, but I'd pushed those doubts aside, choosing to focus on the future rather than dwelling on the past. "I don't know," I said. "But knowing Victoria, it's probably another manipulation, another way to gain leverage. Let's hope so. But we should be prepared for anything. People fighting over this kind of money, they can get desperate. They can say and do things you'd never expect. After I hung up with Harold, I called Sarah and asked her to meet me for coffee. We sat in a quiet cafe downtown, away from the well-meaning neighbors and friends who'd been hovering around us since the funeral, and I filled her in on what I'd learned about Victoria's history. "She's done this before," I said, showing Sarah printouts of the newspaper articles I'd found. "Multiple times, she has a pattern of inserting herself into wealthy families, establishing legal claims, and walking away with as much money as possible." Sarah read through the articles with growing disgust. "She's a professional predator. She makes her living off other people's grief." That's exactly what she is. "And now she's targeting Alexander's estate." I leaned back in my chair, suddenly feeling every one of my 67 years. I should have seen this coming. I should have protected him better. "How could you have predicted this? How could anyone have predicted that someone would be sick enough to show up at their own son's funeral looking for a payday? I knew what kind of person she was when she left. I should have made sure she could never come back and hurt him." Sarah reached across the table and took my hand. Alexander was 35 years old. He was a successful, happy, accomplished man who'd built a wonderful life. She didn't hurt him, Jonathan. You protected him from her perfectly. He never knew she was this kind of person. But now she's going to destroy his memory. This trial, this legal battle, it's going to turn him into a cautionary tale about estate planning instead of the celebration of his life that he deserves. Then we make sure that doesn't happen. We fight her and we win, and we make sure his legacy is protected. I looked at Sarah, 28 years old, grieving the loss of the man she'd planned to marry, facing the possibility of a protracted legal battle against a woman with unlimited resources and no moral constraints, and felt a surge of admiration for her strength. "This isn't your fight," I said. "You shouldn't have to go through this. Alexander was going to be my husband. His legacy is my legacy. And besides," she smiled sadly, "she made it my fight when she dismissed me as a distant connection. I want to show her just how wrong she was about that." The next few weeks were a blur of legal meetings and document gathering, and the grinding machinery of the justice system slowly lurching into motion. Victoria's lawyers filed their initial claim, demanding immediate access to Alexander's financial records and asserting her rights as his biological mother. Harold filed our response, challenging her standing and requesting a full investigation into her background and motivations. The local newspapers picked up the story, and suddenly our private grief became public entertainment. "Absent mother claims dead son's fortune," read one headline. "Gold digger targets architect's estate," read another. The coverage was largely sympathetic to our side, but the attention was unwelcome and painful. Sarah and I found ourselves under constant scrutiny, reporters showing up at our homes and offices, asking invasive questions about our relationship with Alexander and our reaction to Victoria's claims. We tried to maintain our dignity, declining most interviews and focusing on the legal battle ahead, but Victoria seemed to thrive on the attention. She gave interview after interview, painting herself as a grieving mother who'd been forced to make difficult choices as a young woman, and was now simply trying to honor her son's memory by ensuring his assets were properly managed. She was polished, articulate, and utterly convincing to anyone who didn't know the truth about her history. "She's good," Harold admitted, after watching one of her television appearances. "She comes across as sympathetic, reasonable, genuinely emotional about Alexander's death. If I didn't know better, I might believe her myself." "But you do know better. We have evidence of what she really is. Evidence that will be ruled inadmissible if it's not directly relevant to the inheritance claim. The judge isn't going to let us turn this into a character assassination, no matter how well-deserved it might be." That's when I decided to take matters into my own hands. I hired a private investigator, a former police detective named Marcus Chen, who specialized in financial crimes and family disputes. I gave him everything I'd found about Victoria's history and asked him to dig deeper, to find the connections and patterns that might not be obvious from newspaper articles and public records. "This woman has been working this angle for 30 years, I told him. "There have to be other victims, other families she's targeted. Find them." Marcus went to work with the methodical thoroughness of someone who'd spent decades tracking down criminals and con artists. Within 2 weeks, he'd uncovered a network of financial manipulation that went far beyond what I'd discovered on my own. There was the elderly widower in Connecticut, whose will had been mysteriously changed shortly before his death, leaving everything to his devoted caregiver, Victoria, instead of his children. There was the tech entrepreneur whose business partner had turned out to be a shell company controlled by Victoria, allowing her to claim half his assets when the partnership dissolved. There was the cancer researcher whose grant money had disappeared, only to surface months later in accounts linked to Victoria's various aliases. "She's been doing this for 3 decades, Marcus explained as he laid out the evidence in my living room. Different names, different approaches, but the same basic pattern. She identifies vulnerable targets, usually wealthy men dealing with loss or transition, establishes a relationship based on false pretenses, and then manipulates the legal system to extract as much money as possible. How many victims? At least a dozen that I can document, probably more. The total amount she's stolen or manipulated over the years, we're talking about tens of millions of dollars. I stared at the photographs and documents spread across my coffee table, evidence of a career built on exploitation and betrayal. Victoria wasn't just a neglectful mother or an opportunistic gold digger. She was a professional criminal whose entire adult life had been dedicated to stealing from grieving families. Will this be enough to stop her? It should be. But there's something else you need to see. Marcus pulled out a file folder marked with Alexander's name. I did some digging into his birth records, his early medical history. There's something here that doesn't add up. My heart stopped. What do you mean? The dates don't match up with what Victoria claimed about his conception. According to the medical records, Alexander was born 3 weeks earlier than his official birth certificate indicates, and there's a note in the hospital file about paternal uncertainty that was never resolved. The room seemed to spin around me. I sat down heavily, my mind racing through the implications. Are you saying Alexander might not be my son? I'm saying Victoria lied about something related to his birth, maybe about the timing, maybe about paternity, maybe about both. The question is why, and whether it affects her legal claim to his estate. I thought about Alexander's face, about the way he'd smiled, the way he'd laughed, the 1,000 small gestures and expressions that had marked him as unmistakably mine. Genetics aside, he'd been my son in every way that mattered. But if Victoria could prove he wasn't biologically mine, even if he wasn't my biological son, I raised him. I was his father, in every way that counted. Legally, that might not matter. If she can prove you're not his biological father, and if there's no adoption paperwork, she could argue that you have no legal standing at all, that as his only biological parent, she's entitled to everything. The cruelty of it was breathtaking. After 32 years of silence, Victoria wasn't just trying to steal Alexander's inheritance. She was trying to erase my entire relationship with him, to reduce 35 years of love and devotion to a legal technicality. We need to find out the truth, I said. Whatever it is, we need to know. Marcus nodded. I can arrange for DNA testing. There's enough biological material from Alexander's medical records to run a comparison. But are you sure you want to know? Because once we open this door, we can't close it again. I thought about that for a long moment. Did I want to know if the son I'd raised and loved wasn't biologically mine? Did I want to risk discovering that my entire life had been built on a lie? But then I thought about Victoria, about her calculated cruelty, about her willingness to destroy anything and anyone in pursuit of money. Do it, I said. Whatever the truth is, I need to know. The DNA results came back a week later. Marcus delivered them in person, his expression grim as he handed me the sealed envelope. Before you open that, he said, I want you to know something. I've been doing this work for 20 years, and I've seen a lot of families destroyed by secrets and lies. But I've also seen families that were stronger than biology, stronger than legal documents, stronger than anything someone like Victoria could throw at them. Whatever that envelope says, it doesn't change who you are or who Alexander was. I opened the envelope with trembling hands. The technical language was dense and clinical, but the conclusion was clear. 99.7% probability that Alexander Blake was not my biological son. I stared at the paper for a long time, the words blurring as tears filled my eyes. Alexander wasn't mine. Not genetically, not biologically. The son I'd raised, the boy I'd taught to ride a bike and helped with homework and watched graduate from college, He'd never been mine at all. "I'm sorry," Marcus said quietly. I looked up at him, surprised to find that alongside the grief and shock, I felt something else. Anger. Not at Alexander, not at the situation, but at Victoria. She'd known. She'd known all along that Alexander wasn't my biological son, and she'd let me raise him anyway. She'd let me love him, let me build my entire life around being his father, and now she was using that love against me. "She knew," I said. "Victoria knew he wasn't mine, and she never told me." "That's what I think too. The question is, can we prove it? And more importantly, can we use it against her?" I thought about that. Victoria's entire legal claim was based on her status as Alexander's biological mother. But if she'd deliberately concealed the truth about his paternity, if she'd allowed me to believe I was his father while knowing I wasn't, she committed fraud, I said slowly. She let me raise a child that wasn't mine, let me pay for his support and education and medical care, all while knowing I had no legal obligation to do so. That's fraud on a massive scale. Marcus smiled for the first time since he'd arrived. "Now you're thinking like a lawyer. If we can prove she knew the truth about Alexander's paternity and deliberately concealed it, we can argue that she forfeited any parental rights through fraud and abandonment. More than that, we can argue that you became Alexander's legal father through estoppel, that her deliberate deception created a father-son relationship that the law should protect." The next few days were a whirlwind of legal research and strategy sessions. Harold brought in a specialist in inheritance law, a sharp-eyed woman named Patricia Huang, who'd built her career defending against exactly the kind of opportunistic claims Victoria was making. "This changes everything," Patricia explained, as we sat in Harold's conference room surrounded by law books and case files. "If we can prove Victoria knew Jonathan wasn't Alexander's biological father and deliberately allowed him to assume parental responsibility, we can argue several different legal theories: fraud, estoppel, intentional misrepresentation. The courts don't look kindly on people who try to profit from their own deception. But we still need proof that she knew, Harold pointed out. DNA results showing Jonathan isn't the father aren't enough. We need evidence that Victoria was aware of this fact at the time. That's where Marcus earned his fee. He went back to Victoria's medical records from Alexander's birth, obtained through a combination of legal subpoenas and old-fashioned detective work. What he found was damning. Victoria had requested multiple paternity tests during her pregnancy, something that was unusual in 1988, but not unheard of. The tests had been inconclusive due to the limitations of the technology at the time, but there were enough discrepancies to raise serious questions about Alexander's paternity. More importantly, there was a handwritten note in Victoria's medical file from her obstetrician, Dr. Eleanor Summers, who was now retired but still living in Boston. The note read, "Patient expresses concern about paternity, discussed options for testing after birth. Patient specifically requested that no information be shared with presumed father until testing complete." Dr. Summers remembered Victoria clearly when Marcus contacted her. The conversation, as she recounted it, was revealing. She was very young, very frightened, but also very calculating, Dr. Summers told us during a video call from her retirement home. She knew there was a question about the baby's paternity, but she was adamant that the father, you, Mr. Blake, not be told until she decided what to do with the information. "Did she ever follow through with the paternity testing after Alexander was born?" I asked. "Oh yes. She had it done privately, about 2 weeks after the birth. I wasn't involved in that testing, but she called me afterward to discuss the results. She was relieved, I suppose, is the best way to put it. She said the test had resolved her concerns and that she wouldn't be needing any further assistance with the matter." "Did she tell you what the results were?" Dr. Summers hesitated. "Not directly, but the impression I got was that you weren't the biological father, Mr. Blake. She seemed almost pleased about it, as if it solved some problem for her. The pieces were falling into place. Victoria had known from the beginning that Alexander wasn't my son, but she'd let me believe otherwise. She'd allowed me to sign the birth certificate, to take financial responsibility, to build a life around being his father. And then, when it suited her purposes, she'd disappeared, leaving me to raise a child that wasn't biologically mine while she pursued other opportunities. Now, 32 years later, she was back to claim the inheritance of the son she'd never wanted. using the same deception that had allowed her to escape responsibility in the first place. Armed with this new evidence, Patricia filed a motion to dismiss Victoria's claim on the grounds of fraud and estoppel. The legal argument was complex, but the moral argument was simple. Victoria couldn't profit from her own deception. She couldn't abandon a child and then return decades later to claim his inheritance, especially when that abandonment was based on deliberate fraud. Victoria's lawyers fought back hard. They argued that the paternity issue was irrelevant, that Victoria's biological connection to Alexander gave her rights regardless of who his father was. They claimed that any deception was the result of confusion and fear on the part of a young, frightened mother, not calculated fraud. But our evidence was overwhelming. We had medical records showing Victoria's deliberate concealment of the paternity questions. We had Dr. Summers's testimony about Victoria's reaction to the test results. We had documentation of her pattern of financial manipulation over the past 30 years. Most damaging of all, we had Victoria's own words from that first night at my house. Marcus had suggested I record any future conversations with her, and I'd followed his advice. When Victoria called me 2 weeks before the hearing, trying to negotiate a settlement, I was ready. "You know this is going to get ugly, Jonathan," she said, her voice carrying that familiar tone of false reasonableness. "The paternity issue, the questions about Alexander's real father. Do you really want all of that to become public? Do you want his memory tainted by scandal? What are you talking about, Victoria? Oh, come now. You must have figured it out by now. The timing, the dates. Alexander wasn't your son, Jonathan. He never was. I let you believe otherwise because it was convenient at the time, but the truth has a way of coming out, doesn't it?" The casual cruelty in her voice was breathtaking. She was talking about the revelation that had shattered my world, as if it were a minor inconvenience, a business detail to be managed. "Who was his father?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "Does it matter? He's dead now. The question is, what we do going forward. I'm willing to be reasonable about this, to split the estate 50-50. That's more generous than I need to be, legally speaking. But I'm not unreasonable. I understand you have emotional attachments to his memory." Emotional attachments. 35 years of unconditional love reduced to emotional attachments. And if I don't agree to your generous offer, then we go to court and everything comes out. The paternity questions, the circumstances of Alexander's conception, the fact that you spent 35 years raising another man's child. Is that really how you want his story to end? I thought about Alexander, about the man he'd become despite the circumstances of his birth. He'd been brilliant, compassionate, successful, everything a father could hope for in a son. The fact that we didn't share DNA didn't diminish that. If anything, it made his achievements more remarkable, because he'd become the man he was through choice and character, rather than genetic inheritance. "Victoria," I said, my voice filled with a certainty that surprised even me. "I don't care whose biological son Alexander was. I was his father in every way that mattered. I raised him, I loved him. I was there for every important moment of his life. You weren't. You chose to walk away and now you want to profit from that choice. But I won't let you. I'll fight you in court and I'll expose you for what you really are. You'll regret this decision, Jonathan, I promise you that." "No," I said. "The only thing I regret is not protecting Alexander from you 35 years ago." The recording of that conversation became the centerpiece of our defense. Victoria's own words proved that she'd known about the paternity issue all along, that she'd deliberately concealed it, and that she was now trying to use it as leverage to extort money from Alexander's estate. The hearing was held on a grey Tuesday morning in November, exactly 2 months after Alexander's funeral. The courtroom was packed with reporters and curious onlookers, all drawn by the sensational nature of the case. I sat at the plaintiff's table with Harold and Patricia, trying to project confidence while my stomach churned with anxiety. Victoria sat across the aisle with her team of expensive lawyers, looking every inch the grieving mother in her black designer suit and understated jewelry. She'd perfected the role over the years, I realized. The concerned parent, the victim of circumstances, the woman who'd made difficult choices and was now trying to do right by her son's memory. But I knew better. We all knew better. Judge Margaret Stevens was a no-nonsense woman in her 60s who'd built her reputation on cutting through legal posturing to get to the heart of matters. She listened to the opening arguments with the patience of someone who'd heard every possible variation of family greed and dysfunction. Victoria's lead attorney, a silver-haired man named Robert Cartwright, painted her as a tragic figure, a young mother who'd made the ultimate sacrifice by giving up her son to ensure he had a stable home, only to be vilified for trying to honor his memory through proper management of his estate. My client gave up her most precious possession, her relationship with her son, because she believed it was in his best interest, Cartwright argued. She has spent 32 years living with that sacrifice, watching from afar as Alexander grew into the remarkable man we all knew him to be. Now, in death, she seeks only to ensure that his legacy is preserved and his wishes honored. It was a masterful performance, and I could see several members of the gallery nodding along with his narrative. Victoria had chosen her representation well, but Patricia was equally skilled, and she had the advantage of truth on her side. "Your Honor," she began, "this case isn't about a mother's love or sacrifice. It's about fraud, manipulation, and greed. The evidence will show that Victoria Pemberton deliberately deceived Jonathan Blake about his paternity of Alexander, allowing him to assume financial and emotional responsibility for a child, while she pursued other opportunities. Now, 32 years later, when that child has become a successful man with a substantial estate, she returns to claim the benefits of a relationship she never had with a son she never wanted." Patricia methodically laid out our evidence. The medical records showing Victoria's deception, Dr. Summers's testimony about her reaction to the paternity tests, the recorded conversation revealing her willingness to use Alexander's memory as leverage. But the most powerful moment came when I took the stand to testify about my relationship with Alexander. "Mr. Blake," Patricia asked, "when you learned that Alexander might not be your biological son, how did that change your feelings about him?" I looked out at the packed courtroom, at Sarah sitting in the front row with tears in her eyes, at Victoria's cold, calculating expression. "It didn't change anything," I said, my voice carrying clearly through the silent room. "Alexander was my son from the moment he was born until the moment he died, not because of genetics or biology, but because of love. I was there when he took his first steps, when he said his first words, when he learned to ride a bike. I helped him with his homework, taught him to drive, walked him through his first heartbreak. I was there for every triumph and every failure, every joy and every sorrow. That's what makes someone a father. Not DNA, but presence. Not blood, but love." I paused, looking directly at Victoria. Victoria gave birth to Alexander, but she was never his mother. A mother doesn't abandon her child. A mother doesn't disappear for 32 years and then show up looking for a payday. A mother doesn't use her child's death as an opportunity for profit. The courtroom was absolutely silent when I finished. Even Victoria's lawyers seemed subdued, as if they realized the moral bankruptcy of their client's position. Victoria herself took the stand later that day, and it was a disaster for her case. Under Patricia's cross-examination, her carefully constructed facade began to crumble. She was evasive about the paternity issue, contradictory about her reasons for leaving, and utterly unconvincing when she tried to claim maternal feelings for a son she'd never attempted to contact. "Miss Pemberton," Patricia asked, "in 32 years, did you ever send Alexander a birthday card?" The situation was complicated. I thought it was better if I stayed away. "Did you ever call him on Christmas?" As I said, I believed my absence was in his best interest. "Did you send him a graduation gift when he finished high school, college, medical school?" I followed his achievements from a distance. I was proud of what he accomplished. "But you never told him that, did you? You never reached out to congratulate him, to express that pride, to let him know you were thinking of him?" Victoria's composure was cracking. "I wanted to, many times. But I believed. You believed it was better to stay away when there was no money involved. But now that he's dead and left a substantial estate, suddenly maternal feelings have compelled you to claim his inheritance. That's not... You're twisting my words." "Am I? Isn't it true that the only reason you're here today is because Alexander died wealthy? Isn't it true that if he died poor, you never would have bothered to attend his funeral, let alone contest his estate?" Victoria's silence was answer enough. The trial lasted 3 days, but the outcome was never really in doubt. Judge Stevens took less than an hour to render her verdict. This court finds that Victoria Pemberton's claim to Alexander Blake's estate is without merit, she announced, her voice carrying the authority of absolute certainty. The evidence clearly shows a pattern of deliberate deception and abandonment that forfeits any parental rights she might have claimed. Moreover, the court finds that Jonathan Blake's 35-year relationship with Alexander, built on love, support, and unwavering commitment, establishes him as the de facto father, regardless of biological parentage. She paused, looking directly at Victoria. This court is particularly troubled by the plaintiff's apparent willingness to exploit her son's death for financial gain. The evidence suggests a calculated and callous disregard for Alexander's memory and the genuine grief of those who actually knew and loved him. Victoria's face went white with rage, but she said nothing, as the judge continued. Furthermore, this court recommends that the District Attorney's Office investigate Ms. Pemberton's financial history for evidence of fraud and criminal activity. The pattern of behavior documented in this case suggests she may have victimized other families in similar circumstances. The gavel came down with finality, and it was over. Victoria Pemberton's last attempt to profit from abandoning her son had failed completely. As the courtroom emptied, Victoria approached me one final time. Her composure was gone, replaced by naked fury and desperation. "This isn't over, Jonathan," she hissed. "You think you've won, but you don't know what you're dealing with. I'll appeal this decision. I'll take it to the Supreme Court if I have to." "Go ahead," I said calmly. "But you'll lose every time, because the truth doesn't change. You abandoned Alexander when he needed you, and I was there. You chose money over motherhood, and I chose love over biology. The law recognizes that, and so does anyone with a functioning conscience." Victoria turned and walked away, her heels clicking sharply on the marble floor. It was the last time I ever saw her. True to her word, Victoria did appeal the decision. Her lawyers filed motion after motion, challenging every aspect of the ruling, demanding new hearings and different judges. But each appeal was rejected, sometimes unanimously, sometimes with written opinions that were even more scathing than Judge Stevens's original verdict. The appeals process dragged on for 18 months, during which Victoria's financial resources were steadily depleted by legal fees and court costs. The criminal investigation that Judge Stevens had recommended also bore fruit. The FBI found evidence linking Victoria to at least 6 cases of inheritance fraud spanning 3 decades. She was eventually indicted on multiple counts of wire fraud, money laundering, and conspiracy. Rather than face trial, Victoria accepted a plea bargain that sent her to federal prison for 8 years and required her to pay restitution to her victims. The last I heard, she was serving her sentence at a minimum security facility in Pennsylvania, her days of manipulating grieving families finally at an end. Alexander's estate was distributed according to his wishes. The bulk of it went to establishing a foundation that provides architectural services to low-income communities, helping to design and build affordable housing, community centers, and schools. Sarah became the foundation's executive director, channeling her grief into continuing Alexander's work. I used my portion of the inheritance to endow a scholarship at Alexander's alma mater for students pursuing architecture with a focus on social impact. Every year I attend the award ceremony and tell the recipients about Alexander, about his vision, his integrity, his belief that the spaces we create can make the world more beautiful and more just. But the most important legacy isn't measured in dollars or buildings or legal precedents. It's measured in the understanding that family isn't about blood or biology or genetic inheritance. Family is about love, commitment, presence, and sacrifice. It's about being there when it matters, about choosing each other every day for 35 years. Victoria gave birth to Alexander, but she was never his mother. I may not have been his biological father, but I was his dad in every way that mattered. And nothing, not DNA tests or legal challenges or the calculated cruelty of a woman who saw her own son as a commodity, can ever change that. I think about Alexander every day, and I know he would be proud of how his story ended. Not with bitterness or division, but with justice. Not with the triumph of greed, but with the vindication of love. Not with the destruction of his memory, but with the continuation of his work. He taught me that the most important things in life can't be inherited or stolen or contested in court. Love, integrity, compassion, the commitment to make the world a little better than you found it, these things can only be chosen, nurtured, and passed on through example. Victoria chose money. I chose love. And in the end, love won. It always does.